My name is Evelisse Lane. I was 31 when the life I had built for 6 years came apart in front of 200 witnesses, a string quartet, and a cake I had chosen because it reminded me of my mother's kitchen. I remember the silence first. Not the gasp, the silence before the gasp, the half-second where the room hadn't decided yet how to feel. I was standing at the end of the aisle in ivory silk, my hand still warm from my father's arm, when my fiancé's sister leaned toward the front row and said, just loud enough, "Is he really going through with it? After everything with Marisol?" I didn't know who Marisol was. I would, within the hour. Daniel didn't deny it when I asked him in the vestibule, my bouquet crushed in my fist. He didn't even look ashamed, only inconvenienced, like I'd caught him in a scheduling conflict rather than a 2-year affair with a woman his own mother had picked out for him long before I arrived. "You were supposed to be the practical choice," he said, and I understood, finally, that I had never been chosen. I had been settled for, and even that had run out. I walked back down the aisle alone. I didn't cry in front of them. I saved that for the car, where my hand shook so hard I couldn't get the seatbelt into its buckle, and I sat there in the parking lot in my wedding dress until the streetlights came on. What no one in that church knew, what I had never told Daniel because he never asked, was that I had spent my whole life being the practical choice. The steady daughter. The one who didn't need celebrating because she never seemed to need anything. My younger sister got the recitals and the trust fund talk and the photographs on the mantle. I got the quiet nod, the "you're so responsible, Evie," the sense that love in my family was a finite resource and I had learned, early, not to ask for my share. I am a financial risk analyst. I read contracts the way other people read weather, for what's coming. I should have read Daniel's silences the same way. I didn't because some part of me still believed that if I was careful enough, patient enough, good enough, someone would finally choose me on purpose. That night, I checked into a hotel 3 towns over, hung the dress in the closet like it belonged to someone else, and opened my laptop instead of crying again. I had a meeting Monday with a client I'd never met in person, a reclusive conglomerate owner named Julian Voss, whose company needed a discreet audit before a merger. I remember thinking almost bitterly that at least numbers never lied to you the way people did. I had no idea that Monday's meeting would be the second time in 1 week that my life stopped making sense. Julian Voss's office was on the 40th floor of a building with no name on the outside, only glass, and the kind of quiet that money buys. I arrived with my portfolio under one arm, and my wedding still fresh enough that I flinched at the sight of a bridal shop across the street. He didn't stand when I walked in, which I appreciated more than I expected to. He simply gestured at the chair across from him and said, "You're the analyst who found the discrepancy in the Kessler account before my own CFO did." Not a question. A fact he wanted confirmed. "I read carefully," I said. "Most people read quickly. There's a difference." He studied me for a moment longer than business required. "You look like someone who got some very bad news recently." I hadn't planned to tell him, but something about the stillness of that office, no photographs, no clutter, no performance, made honesty feel less dangerous than usual. "I got left at the altar 4 days ago," I said, "by a man who apparently already had someone else's name written where mine should have been." He didn't offer sympathy. He offered something rarer. "Then you understand," he said, "what it costs to be the convenient option instead of the necessary one. I've spent my whole career being necessary. It's lonelier than people assume." I would learn, over the following weeks, that Julian Voss had built an empire out of 4 brothers' inheritance and 1 dead father's controlling shares, and that his family, like mine, mistook obligation for love. His 3 younger brothers, all CEOs of divisions within the same company, had spent years competing for a father's approval that had died with the man himself, never once turning that competition toward each other in cruelty. If anything, I would come to see, they had simply never been taught how to need anyone without transaction attached. What began as a 6-week audit became something neither of us named for a long time. He didn't court me the way Daniel once had, with restaurants chosen to impress witnesses. He sent me case files at midnight with a single line, "Tell me what you actually think, not what you think I want to hear," and I found, for the first time in my life, that being useful and being wanted were not mutually exclusive. When he proposed, 6 months later, In the empty boardroom where we'd had our first real argument about a subsidiary's ethics, he didn't kneel. He slid a folder across the table. Inside was a single page, a prenuptial agreement that protected my independence, not his fortune. "I don't want you settled for me," he said. "I want you audited me," and stayed anyway. I said yes before I finished reading page 2. The Voss family did not throw an engagement party. They convened a dinner, which I would later understand was the same thing, wearing better manners. Marcus, the eldest of the 3 brothers and CEO of Voss Logistics, arrived 20 minutes early to study me before I could compose myself, a habit, I realized, born of years spent guessing which version of a person was real. Theo, who ran the technology division, asked about my audit findings before he asked my name, and seemed almost relieved when I answered in specifics instead of flattery. Gabriel, the youngest, quietest, and by reputation the most ruthless negotiator among them, said almost nothing all evening except, near the end, "Julian doesn't bring people to family dinners. You should know that means something." I understood, watching them, that I wasn't meeting in-laws. I was meeting 4 men who had spent their entire adult lives testing everyone who came near their brother because the last people who'd claimed to love this family had used that love as leverage. Their mother had left when the youngest was 6. Their father had run the company like a competition with no finish line and rewarded affection with quarterly performance reviews. I recognized the shape of it immediately because I had grown up fluent in the same language, the kind spoken by families where love is rationed and scrutiny is mistaken for care. So I didn't perform warmth I didn't feel yet, and I didn't shrink from their questions either. When Marcus asked, pointedly, what I would do if Julian's company failed and his fortune with it, I told him the truth. I'd still be an analyst. I was one before I met him. I'll be one after, whatever after looks like. Something in his face eased, fractionally, like a man setting down a weight he'd carried so long he'd forgotten it was there. By the end of that dinner, Theo had already sent me a technical paper he wanted my opinion on. Gabriel walked me to my car and said, without preamble, "For what it's worth, the wedding that fell apart. His loss was calculable. Ours is that we almost didn't get to know you." It was the closest thing to warmth I'd ever heard from a stranger, and I understood it was not a small thing coming from him. I married Julian in a courthouse 11 days later, with his 3 brothers as witnesses and my own family, informed but not truly invited, watching from a distance they had chosen for themselves years ago. I did not know yet that the 4 Voss men would come to treat me not as an addition to protect, but as the missing variable that finally made their family's arithmetic make sense. I only knew that for the first time since I was a girl watching my sister unwrap gifts meant, somehow, for both of us, I felt like someone worth building a life around, not settling for. I also did not know that Daniel wasn't finished with me yet. It arrived on a Tuesday, forwarded by 3 separate colleagues before I'd had my coffee. A business gossip column with a headline, "Gold Digger Analyst Trades Jilted Groom for Billionaire. Sources say she planned it all along." The sources, unnamed, claimed I had orchestrated the wedding collapse myself, having already identified Julian as a target during the Kessler audit months earlier. It was a tidy story. It was also, I recognized within the first paragraph, written by someone who understood financial timelines well enough to fabricate a convincing one, someone with access to internal dates that had never been public. I sat with the article for a long time before I brought it to Julian, not because I feared his reaction, but because some old reflex in me still expected to be believed less than I would be doubted. That reflex I was learning belonged to my old life. It took me a full 10 minutes to remember I didn't live there anymore. Julian read it twice, in silence, then set his phone down with a stillness I would come to recognize as his version of controlled anger. "Whoever wrote this had our merger calendar," he said. "That calendar had 6 names on it. Yours, mine, my 3 brothers, and Marisol Ferris, who now works, as it happens, in Daniel's family's PR firm." I felt something in my chest that wasn't quite fear and wasn't quite vindication, a third thing, colder and steadier, that I recognized from every ledger I'd ever balanced, the quiet certainty that comes just before the numbers align. I didn't ask Julian to destroy anyone. I asked for the calendar's access logs. Gabriel, when told, didn't raise his voice either. He simply opened his laptop at the dinner table and began pulling metadata with the unhurried focus of a man who had spent years learning that the coldest revenge is documentation. Theo cross-referenced login timestamps against the article's publication schedule. Marcus, quieter than either of them, made a single phone call to a journalist he trusted and said only, "Before you run anything else on this, you should see what we're about to send you." I sat at the center of my new family's dining table that night, watching four brothers who had spent their whole lives distrusting affection turn their formidable attention, without hesitation, toward defending mine, not with cruelty, not with threats, but with the same patient precision I had once used to save their company from a discrepancy no one else had noticed. I understood, watching them work, that I had not married into rescue. I had married into reciprocity. The truth, when it surfaced, was almost anticlimactic in its ordinariness, which is, I've learned, how most betrayals actually look, stripped of the drama people imagine. Daniel had known about the merger calendar for months, because Marisol had access to it through her firm's minor contract with Voss Logistics, months before the wedding. He hadn't left me for her out of passion. He'd left me because Marisol's family connections offered him a partnership track his own firm had denied him twice, and the article, timed 6 months later, had been a preemptive strike, an attempt to control the story before I could tell it myself, should our engagement ever become public knowledge worth protecting. I read the internal emails Gabriel's team had lawfully obtained through discovery once the defamation claim was filed, and I felt, strangely, very little anger. Only a kind of tired clarity, the way you feel finishing a book whose ending you'd already guessed by chapter 3. We did not destroy Daniel. Julian was very clear about that, in a conversation late one night that I now understand was as much for his own brother's benefit as mine. "We're not becoming people who ruin others for satisfaction," he said. "We correct the record. We let consequence do the rest." The retraction ran 2 weeks later, in the same publication, with considerably less prominence than the original, as these things always are, but with enough specificity that anyone who mattered understood exactly what had happened and why. Daniel's partnership track collapsed anyway, not because we intervened, but because the firm that had courted him discovered, in the course of its own due diligence, that a man willing to fabricate a defamation campaign against a former fiancé was not a man they wanted holding client trust. Marisol's firm quietly dropped its contract with Voss Logistics. No one shouted. No one was humiliated in public. The consequences simply arrived, unhurried, the way water finds its level without anyone having to push it there. My own family called, once the story became impossible to avoid. My sister asked, carefully, whether I might introduce her to one of the brothers. My mother asked whether the article's claims were true. Neither asked how I was. I told my mother the truth, that I had not planned any of it, that I had simply, for once in my life, been believed by people who loved me before I proved myself useful to them, and I let the silence that followed answer the rest of her questions on its own. There is a particular kind of exhaustion that comes after vindication, one no one warns you about. You expect triumph. What you get instead is the sudden, disorienting quiet of a fight you no longer have to keep having. I spent the weeks after the retraction doing very ordinary things, reviewing quarterly reports with Theo, arguing with Marcus about a logistics contract I thought undervalued its own liability exposure, sitting on Gabriel's balcony while he taught me, badly and without patience, how to make espresso the way their mother once had, before she left. I noticed that none of them ever asked me to be grateful. They simply kept including me, the way you include someone who has always belonged, rather than someone who was rescued into belonging. Julian found me one evening on our own balcony, looking at the wedding dress I had finally deliberately given to a donation center that week, not out of forgiveness for Daniel, but because I no longer needed to keep a monument to the version of myself who thought being chosen required being convenient. "You never asked me to fix it," he said. "The article, your family, any of it. You just kept doing your job like the ground wasn't moving." "I spent 31 years learning that no one comes when you ask," I said. "It took me a while to understand that you all came anyway before I asked." He didn't say anything grand in response. He simply sat with me until the light changed, which I had come to understand was his family's particular dialect of love, not declarations, but presence. Unforced. Unbilled. I thought, that night, about the girl in the parking lot in her ruined wedding dress, certain that being left meant something irreversible about her worth. I did not forgive her for believing that exactly. I understood her instead. The way you understand a younger sibling's fear, with tenderness rather than judgment. Marisol reached out once, nearly a year later, not to apologize but to ask, with a particular entitlement of someone who has never had to earn anything, whether I might put in a word for her at Voss Logistics, since the old contract had just been a misunderstanding. I considered, briefly, the version of myself who might have used that moment cruelly, who might have listed, point by point, every calculated thing she and Daniel had done, and watched her flinch. I found I had no appetite for it. Not because I had gone soft, but because I finally understood something my new family had known long before I arrived. That revenge spent on someone who never valued you is a coin spent twice for nothing. No, I told her. Just that. I didn't need to explain the arithmetic of it. She would spend a long time, I suspected, trying to understand a refusal that offered her no drama to react to, no righteous fury to reframe herself as the misunderstood party within. Silence, I had learned from four brothers who rarely raised their voices, was the only currency some people could never counterfeit their way into. Daniel, for his part, sent one email months later, not an apology, not quite, but an admission dressed as one, that he had underestimated what I was worth because he'd never had to notice it before, since I had never made him. I read it twice, the way I read contracts, checking for what he actually meant beneath what he'd written. What I found was regret without responsibility, a man mourning the convenience he'd lost, not the person he'd discarded to find it. I didn't respond. Some ledgers, I have learned, are better left closed than corrected line by line for someone who will only misread the total anyway. I still think, sometimes, about that phrase, the practical choice, the one Daniel used like an insult on the worst day of my old life. He meant it as the reason I wasn't worth keeping. I have come, slowly, to understand it differently. I am still practical. I still read contracts like weather and trust documentation over declarations. But I married into a family that taught me practicality and devotion were never opposites, that the same patience which finds a discrepancy in a merger agreement can also, given the right people, find its way toward love that doesn't need performing to be real. Marcus calls me, these days, when he wants the truth about a bad decision before his ego catches up to it. Theo sends midnight case files with the same line Julian once used, as though it's become the family's private password. Tell me what you actually think. Gabriel, still the quietest, still the one who trusts least easily, brought me coffee unprompted last week and said only, "You were the right variable," before walking away, which I understood, by now, to be nearly a declaration of love. I kept one thing from my old life. Not the dress, not the ring I sent back, but the memory of that parking lot, headlights fading, myself in ruined silk believing the worst thing that could happen to a woman was being left. I keep it not out of pain anymore, but as a kind of ledger entry, proof of what I was worth even when no one around me could calculate it correctly. I was the practical choice once, to a man who mistook usefulness for worthlessness. I am something else now. To four brothers and one husband who understood, long before I let myself believe it, that being necessary and being loved were never meant to be different things at all. My name is Evelisse Lane. I am the woman who was left at the altar, and I am the woman four brothers chose to keep, and I have finally stopped needing those to be different stories.